It is a genuine privilege and honour for me to be here, and I'm also grateful to Professor Morgan for the honour of inviting me to give the Hugh Gaitskell Memorial Lecture this evening. The impact of climate change has the potential to spark future conflict over scarce water resources. And as we look ahead to the Copenhagen conference in just 40 days, I believe that it is no exaggeration to say that a fair, effective and ambitious deal there could be more vital to tackling global poverty than even the Gleneagles Summit of 2005. Because climate change is not some future possibility for many of the world's poorest people, it is a contemporary crisis. I've seen that for myself on my own travels across the developing world, where I've seen the impact of climate change in a whole number of communities, from the Kenyan man who told me that the seasons he remembered as a child had simply disappeared, to the people of Bangladesh who have had their homes swept away by the rising floodwaters, to the Ethiopian women I met last year who had been forced by drought to walk further each day to collect water until they were walking 5 hours a day simply to drink from a watering hole shared by people and animals alike. These people are the least responsible for the climate change that is happening, yet they are already the most affected by it. And as we look to the future, it is clear that climate change will increasingly hit the poor hardest. Let me be frank, while many of us came together in 2005 in our endeavours to make poverty history, climate change threatens to make poverty the future for millions of our fellow citizens. That is why we have not only a self-interest, but also, I would argue, a moral responsibility to the developing world to work for a fair deal on climate change at Copenhagen. I believe such a deal should be subjected to 5 development tests. Our first priority must be to agree a long-term goal with credible interim targets to contain temperatures to within 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. Anything less rigorous would pose serious threats for the most vulnerable states in our world. Second, and with a goal established, we need to allocate the task of meeting it in a way that is fair and equitable. That means developed countries taking the greatest responsibility for cutting emissions, given both our historical responsibilities and our higher emissions per head compared with even the most advanced developing countries. Thirdly, we need to reorder the global economy towards low-carbon development. Crucial to achieving this will be effective carbon markets that have a greater impact in reducing global emissions and increases the flow of finance to the least developed countries. The fourth test should be the ability of a deal to support the development and diffusion of low-carbon technologies. For the greening of our global economy is fundamental to ensuring both the resilience and sustainability of our recovery. Fifthly, and finally, we must ensure that any climate change deal includes support for developing countries to adapt to the now inevitable consequences of climate change. In short, we do need a deal in Copenhagen that includes everyone. Of central importance in getting developing countries to the table will therefore be agreeing a consensus around the financial support that the developed world will need to provide to help poor countries respond to climate change. This is simply too important an issue for wait-and-see politics or old-fashioned horse trading. Some of this investment will come from carbon markets, but governments will also need to provide additional funding. It is reasonable to provide a small, limited amount of this investment from the aid budget, because in many cases the fight against climate change and the fight against poverty will be one and the same. But the cost of helping developing countries to both reduce emissions and cope with the effects of climate change cannot simply come out of existing aid commitments. That is why, as the United Kingdom, we have committed to providing additional finance over and above our aid commitments to reach 0.7% of gross national income. And that is why we've said that no more than 10% of UK aid will be spent as climate financing. If we don't reach global agreements on providing additional assistance to help the poorest and most vulnerable developing countries adapt to that climate change and get on a low-carbon path to growth, there is a danger that a large proportion of global aid will be diverted from education, from health, and other basic services. So I do believe that it's not only right morally, but right for developed countries to provide that additional assistance it will be essential to securing a deal in Copenhagen. And given that climate change will affect all of us, it is in all of our interests to help developing countries to leapfrog dirty technologies and find a low-carbon path to growth. The earlier we start the process, the cheaper it will be in the long run. I think that my contribution to our discussions this evening on the future of aid could quite easily be entitled "The Challenge of Interdependence." The rapid and inexorable advance of globalization means that we can't escape each other on this shrinking planet, so we must instead come together to tackle our shared challenges of poverty, of peace, and of climate change. None of this will be easy, but we must together grasp the opportunity to bring about that real and lasting change. Thank you very much indeed.
The Secretary of State made this connection between climate change and poverty alleviation, and he's spot on. And Copenhagen not only should address whether we're meeting the Millennium Development Goals, but also what we can do in terms of building up support for managing climate change and its consequences in developing countries.
I think it was fantastic. I think many of the things he said are in tune with my own views on international development and the work I do in the UK to promote a critical awareness of global issues among young learners in schools.
My sister's actually at Norwich University, and they have a campaign about how Norwich is going to be one of the first universities to be underwater. So I think that's something that we, as students, forget that the UK will be facing these problems as well, and that's something that we should address.
We need a deal in Copenhagen that is fair, that is ambitious, and that's effective. We're going to have to see a deal which limits the increase in global temperatures that's led by the science, but also a deal that delivers genuine additional financing for developing countries already having to cope with the impact of dangerous climate change.